70 people had been detained and that 500 to 700 people had showed up. Police were seen dragging protesters to waiting police vehicles as activists chanted freedom and respect the Constitution. Human rights groups say the Kremlin has repressed the media and cut down civil liberties since Vladimir Putin was first elected president in 2000. They say the situation remains critical under President Dmitry Medvedev. City authorities had earlier turned down the rally organizers' request to hold the protest. And there were scuffles in the northern English city of Leeds and a number of arrests after police tried to separate 2,400 rival demonstrators protesting against Islamic extremism and fascism. 900 English Defence League protesters were contained in the city centre as 1,500 members of a rival group, Unite Against Fascism, gathered nearby. The Unite Against Fascism protest started at midday with protesters chanting slogans denouncing fascism. Protesters from the English Defence League gathered an hour later, singing the British anthem God Save the Queen amid heavy police presence. Police say 5 people were arrested for a number of public order offences after several hundred protesters broke through police lines in Leeds City Square. There were chaotic scenes as the meetings broke up, with demonstrators breaking out of areas cordoned off for them by the police. The English Defence League has held a number of protests around the country against British Islamic extremists in the past month. Leeds has a large Muslim community.
And still ahead in the news, new controversy over newspaper stand tobacco ad. 2 injured in Shan when a glass barrier breaks up. And highlights from the cricket 60s.
The sale of cigarettes. First-time offenders will be liable to a maximum fine of $50,000. But some vendors have put on display promotional glass cabinets with cigarette packets inside. The Tobacco Control Office says it is considering prosecutions. Danielle Tran has more.
From today, tobacco advertising at newspaper stands will be a thing of the past. The Tobacco Control Office has banned the display and distribution of any cigarette ads at all newspaper stalls around the territory. But some vendors are taking the matter into their own hands. They're now openly displaying promotional glass cabinets stacked with cigarette packets. Lu Sha-Ching, chairman of the Coalition of Hong Kong Newspaper and Magazine Merchants, says stalls have been forced to do this to retain business, otherwise customers wouldn't know they still stock cigarettes. The Tobacco Control Office says it has taken steps to prepare the stalls for this change. The office has written letters and made radio and internet announcements about the ban. The removal of the ads around the city has been conducted gradually over the last fortnight. Lu says cigarette sales account for about a third of vendor sales, and businesses have already been affected by the tobacco tax increase earlier this year. He hopes the government will rethink the ban, as store owners are likely to take a huge hit to their business. As a means of getting around the advertising ban, tobacco companies are giving vendors a financial incentive to display the cabinets. They're offering the vendors either 10 free packets of cigarettes or a one-off payment of $400. And in some areas, including Mong Kok and Tsim Sha Tsui, tobacco companies are paying some stands between $500 and $2,000 a month to display these cabinets. The Tobacco Control Office says it is considering prosecuting these hawker stores for displaying these cabinets. But the Tobacco Association of Hong Kong says it has sought legal advice and needs clarification from the government about what actually represents an advertisement. Newspaper hawkers displaying any form of tobacco advertising will be fined up to $50,000. And they will be slapped with an additional daily fine of $1,500 if the offence continues. Danielle Tran, TVB News.
2 people were injured today after a glass barrier shattered at a shopping center in Shan. The glass barrier located on the 5th floor of the shopping mall broke at around 1 p.m. Some of the glass fragments fell onto the 3rd floor where some sale activities were being held. A 32-year-old woman and a 3.5-year-old girl were injured. They were sent to Queen Elizabeth Hospital for treatment. The child's grandmother complained that the shopping center's management had not called the police immediately. But the Link, which manages the mall, said its staff had taken care of the injured after the incident and called the police. The reason for the breaking up of the glass is being investigated.
Last year, over 7,000 people died from heart disease. It's the #2 killer in Hong Kong, but portable defibrillators that are easy to use to resuscitate patients are not commonly available at public places in the city. As Emily Long reports, some first aid groups are calling on the promotion of such devices.
The man who died of a suspected cardiac arrest right outside Caritas Medical Center last year prompted the hospital authority to spend $4 million on 200 portable defibrillators. The machines can now be found in public hospitals and clinics, as well as major reception areas of hospital authority buildings. It may look no bigger than an ordinary first aid box, but you'd be surprised what it can do. Voice commands to teach you how to attach the defibrillator electrodes.
U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is in the Middle East trying to push for stalled peace talks to resume, but she's not having any luck.
Well, Israel says a demand by the Palestinians to stop building illegal settlements on their land is an obstacle to the peace process. Ben O'Rourke reports.
Like many US presidents before him, Barack Obama made peace in the Middle East a top priority when he came into power in January. But so far, all the Nobel Peace Prize winner and his team have been able to do is get both sides to talk about having talks. Now they appear even further away from sitting down at the same table, and the Israelis are blaming the Palestinians.
The simple fact is this: we are willing to engage in peace talks immediately without preconditions. The other fact is that, unfortunately, the other side is not. It is asking and piling on preconditions that it never put on in the 16 years that we've had the peace process.
Last night, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas met US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Abu Dhabi for what were described as frank and difficult talks. In those discussions, Abbas said Israel had to honour its obligations and stop building new settlements on Palestinian land, as agreed in the 2003 US-backed roadmap to peace. But Netanyahu appears to have forgotten that agreement.
It's a change of Palestinian policy, and I hope they change back to the right thing, which is to get into the negotiating tent.
There has never been a precondition. It's always been an issue within the negotiations. What the Prime Minister has offered in specifics of a restraint on the policy of settlements, which he has just described, no new starts, for example, is unprecedented in the context of prior to negotiations.
Clinton's comments were a lot less blunt than her speech back in May, in which she demanded Israel completely halt building all settlements on Palestinian land, something Obama told Netanyahu face-to-face a week earlier at the White House. But since then, Israel has chosen to ignore the US and continue its illegal expansion of settlements and demolition of Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem. Palestinian government spokesman Ghassan al-Khatib said Clinton's trip will not amount to anything unless Washington convinces Israel to stop the expansion. Ben O'Rourke, ATV News.
And now for a look at other stories making news around the world, starting with 6 Chinese Uyghurs being released from the US detention camp at Guantanamo Bay. The 6 ethnic Muslim Uyghur men being held at Guantanamo Bay were transferred to the Pacific Island nation of Palau today. The men were held in the US military prison camp for more than 7 years, despite being cleared of all charges. Lawyers for 3 of the released men said all they want is nothing more than to live peaceful, productive lives in a free, democratic nation safe from oppression. The 6 were among 22 Uyghurs living in a self-contained camp in Afghanistan when the US-led invasion of the country began in 2001. Beijing has demanded they be returned to China, but the US government has refused, saying they would face persecution. 3 world leaders who played key roles in the reunification of Germany got together to share their memories of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and former US President George Bush Sr. were honored at an event in Berlin for their work.
If upon reflecting on the hopeful events of the 2 decades past, I might harbor a single hope, it would be that future generations might look back to the moment when, as a time when mankind really got it right, when we rose above the recriminations of the past and broke a chain of human discontent and resolved our affairs not with rifles, but with reason.
Cole, who now has speech difficulties and is confined to a wheelchair after suffering a stroke, said although Germany's history was not always proud, Germans should be proud of their country's reunification. The world watched as the Berlin Wall was knocked down on the 9th of November 1989. And it was trick-or-treat time at the White House. Or should that be Orange House? Barack Obama's first Halloween as president saw him handing out sweets and pastries baked by his chef to around 2,000 children from nearby schools. Some of his top staff stepped in to help, dressed as frightful ghouls or cartoon characters.
You look good there. Yeah. Can people please not take a picture of my ambassador to the United Nations right now? Our whole concept of engagement is not really going to work.
Explanation to shareholders without having a big audit, I think shouldn't be that difficult.
For a start, there is a huge difference between what you privately show your directors and what you publicly send out. The responsibilities that go with issuing and publishing a statement are huge. It's also then a question of how much information are you expected to give, and the proposals that were made were for a lot of information to be given. And the point is whether this promotes yet more volatility and short-term views being taken. But there is just a huge amount of work in putting out a public quarterly report compared to preparing a monthly account for the board. From our experience, so we introduced a summary annual report because the HSBC annual report, with no pictures and with no real padding, just for the combined regulatory requirements, is something like 350 pages and is indigestible. So we produce a summary annual report, a much slimmer version. It has the pictures, it has rather more narrative, and it has less volumes and volumes of statistics. And it's about 95% of the shareholders go for that. So I think that the message there is that the full regulatory report is only of interest to a very small percentage of the shareholders.
A lot of institutional investors believe that quarterly reporting would be useful. But from the corporate governance perspective, whether quarterly reporting is a good thing is probably too early to say. I think we really need to have research, proper research to look at the benefits and the disadvantages of the cost of quarterly reporting, particularly in Hong Kong. Given that most shareholders in Hong Kong do not read annual reports or anything produced by the company anyway, so does the cost justify the expense?
I don't think quarterly reporting has anything to do with corporate governance, actually. I mean, it's a question of, is it a valuable piece of information to be provided to shareholders? There are, of course, different opinions here. The European tradition is mostly half-yearly account reporting. In the United States, people believe it should be done quarterly. I think the more fundamental question is, what is the cycle of events in most of the businesses in a market? And I don't believe that you'd find in Hong Kong many businesses that have any sort of quarterly rhythm to them at all. And therefore, I don't think that there's a great deal to be achieved by asking people to prepare full sets of accounting standard quality reports every quarter. Regulators seem to have a mistaken idea that companies run themselves through accounting standard-driven reports internally. But it's actually not true. I mean, preparing reports to the standards of the required of the accounting profession is a special exercise in a company. And I think that the answer might be that companies be asked every quarter to provide a qualitative report, just as China Light and Power does, about what's going on in its business, but not to prepare to accounting standards a complete set of quarterly accounts.
Hong Kong is not immune from corporate governance developments in overseas jurisdictions. Many corporate governance requirements, for example, on disclosure of directors' remuneration and greater numbers of independent directors sitting on boards, were first implemented in the US and UK before they were adopted in Hong Kong. Perhaps the most controversial recent overseas development has been the passing of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States. This law significantly tightens the financial reporting requirements for companies with a listing in the United States. CEOs and CFOs, for example, are required to certify the accuracy of the financial data in financial reports. This law has been attacked as an example of over-regulation, and many have claimed that it will reduce the competitiveness of the US market. We asked our guests which overseas corporate governance developments are likely to find their ways to Hong Kong in the near future. And, in particular, will Hong Kong eventually have to go down the same route as the United States and adopt its own Sarbanes-Oxley style financial reporting requirements?
Now, Hong Kong always a very internationalized society. We always learn things from different countries. Before 1997, we have been a British colony, so most of our legal, accounting, and even you can say the CG systems more follow the UK approach. Like our market regulated approach is still adopting what we call the disclosure-based approach. And also we encourage self-discipline, and we encourage market force to regulate many market behavior. I think we're still trying to observe this spirit even so far today. But on the other hand, I think you can see in terms of the market regulated framework, we are more and more following the US model instead of the UK model. I think on the micro firm level, we're still following the UK, but on a more market regulated approach, we are more close to a US approach. What we mean the US approach, that means there are more rules and regulation coded, and they're more prescriptive kind of regulated approach. In US, we always say it's a rule-based, more prescriptive. That means many written rules and codes. We're expecting the player have to follow closely. And I believe we also have to learn more, not just from UK and US. For example, Malaysia, as far as I know, they are the first country in the world.
阿富汗前外长阿卜杜拉宣布退出